We are all so delighted to welcome Ambassador Wendy Sherman to Politics and Prose tonight. Now, I just have to say, it is a very special and personal pleasure for me because Wendy and I go back a few decades and a few incarnations. I think we first met in the late 80s, was it? Would it have been?
Probably mid-80s.
Mid-80s.
Early to mid-80s.
Even longer. Mid-80s. Wendy was the AA for Senator, Congresswoman, woman extraordinaire, Barbara Mikulski, who we are very, very deeply honored to have here tonight. And we thank you for the amazing things that you did over your career, and we still wish you were still, fighting the good fight in there officially. But in any case, Wendy and I met when I was a reporter for the Washington Post covering the Maryland delegation, and you were, working on the Hill for then Congresswoman Mikulski. And, of course, years later, we are now both Exhibit A of women who have not followed linear career paths. So more on that later. Tonight, Wendy's going to be talking about her new book. It's her first book. It's called Not for the Faint of Heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence. Now, I think many of you in the audience know Wendy for her extensive and distinguished career as one of America's leading diplomats, particularly as a key negotiator brokering the Iran nuclear deal, and one of the few representatives of the United States government to have visited and negotiated with North Korea. That is just a tiny scratch of the surface of her professional achievements. When I think about Wendy's life and career, I'm reminded of a book, I don't know if any of you have read it, by the wonderful social anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson. She wrote a book called Composing a Life, and basically she urges women to compose a life for themselves based on their needs and obligations and interests at that moment. And in other words, she suggests that sometimes taking the fastest and most direct route from A to Z is not necessarily as fulfilling or productive as the slower winding path, through the mountains with the good views. Well, Wendy Sherman has composed a life. What a life. She was raised in a civil rights-minded Jewish family in Baltimore. She became a social worker, but never really imagined that unexpected opportunities would lead her to jobs in politics, advocacy, government, diplomacy, and business over nearly, I'm not going to say how many decades, but decades. She's been, as I mentioned, a top staffer for Senator Mikulski, a campaign manager for her Senate race, historic Senate race, executive director of Emily's List, special assistant to President Clinton, counselor to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, the first woman to serve as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. That was under President Obama, and she's currently a senior counselor at the Albright Stonebridge firm. Not for the Faint of Heart is a memoir. In it, she recounts her professional twists and turns as well as personal challenges she's endured along the way, from the suicide of a close family member to inadvertently crashing headfirst into a glass door in a hotel suite in Vienna as she rushed to take a secure phone call from Secretary of State John Kerry, breaking her nose in several places, but nonetheless carrying on with her duties that day. As her book subtitle suggests, this is also a teaching guide with lessons, not only for women, but for anyone interested in the mechanics of how power can and should be used most effectively. She offers clear prescriptions for how effective leaders build teams, establish rules, and inspire teamwork and collaboration in tense and vexing situations. As if North Korea or Iran would be either of those. And we can also be grateful for her eloquent delineation of the differences between diplomats and autocrats. One of the things I like best about Wendy's book is that she gives license to women to be their true selves, whether that means showing emotion when it isn't expected or even welcome, or revealing one's religious orthodoxy when such a move seems high risk or counterintuitive. And after watching the treatment of some of our women senators just these past few weeks and months, in some of the hearings, and not to mention watching Serena Williams at the U.S. Open and what happened to her, Wendy's words are especially welcome and wise. We are so incredibly happy and fortunate that in conversation with Wendy tonight is one of the great students of foreign policy in our country, one of the great writers and reporters of her generation, and a great friend of Politics and Prose. Susan Glasser was a national editor of the Washington Post, editor-in-chief of foreign policy, She's been done assignments overseas. She's sort of the top of the game. And now I hope you all know, she's a staff writer for The New Yorker, and her recent pieces, especially on this administration, have been quite something. So Susan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Wendy. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Wendy Sherman and Susan Lacker.
Well, Liz has pretty much told you everything you need to know about the book. So Wendy and I are going to, she'll sign books now. Liz, thank you so much, not only for that fantastic introduction, I think, both of Ambassador Sherman and also her book, but, really, I probably speak for everybody here in thanking you for keeping Politics and Prose as this incredible convening place. So, Ambassador Sherman and I guess I will call you Wendy, although I learned something interesting about why we call you Ambassador Sherman in this book. And I learned a lot of interesting things, both about the mechanics of diplomacy and some of the backstage drama of the Iran deal. But also I learned a lot of things about you. And that, I think, is the point of a good memoir. I've known you as a journalist and, also as a friend and fellow Washingtonian for years. And I didn't know a lot of the things in the book. Including, by the way, why Senator Mikulski here, how she got you into politics, but also how she got the rest of us comfortable wearing pantsuits. So thank you very much, Senator Mikulski. I would say that the book is as diplomatic as Wendy was known to be in her career, but I have a lot of questions for you today, and I won't focus purely on what's in the book because I figure people are here because they should read the book too. So I can say that, and shameless flackery, so that you don't have to.
I'm happy to flack for the book.
Right. So some of the things that aren't in the book, might be because you are a famously discreet diplomat. But I imagine a lot of people here would be interested, in particular, about your thoughts on the unraveling of the Iran deal, which is really the spine of the book, is the story of how this deal came to be. Now, of course, it's a story of a lot of big acronyms, and for those who care to know, you can find out in this book what's the difference between the EU 3+3 and the P5+1. But I won't spoil that for you. But seriously, tell us, you're quite discreet, about President Trump. You talk about the difference between autocracy and diplomacy in the book, but you don't outright call President Trump an autocrat. Why not? I mean, he's busy saying that you negotiated the worst deal ever.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you all, and thank you all for coming out, and thank you all. I'm not even sure the mic is. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Have to hold it close. Thank you. But great to have you all here tonight, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for reading or listening to the audio tape or reading on your Kindle. It's in all formats. And thank Lissa. See, I'll flack for myself. And Lissa, I'm really grateful for your support and for everything you've done. I think way back in the 80s, you were a fair reporter. I think I was a terrible source, which is what I'm supposed to be. But thank you very much for what you and Bradley have done, as Susan said, for keeping Politics and Prose going. You're a national institution, not just a Washington institution. So thank you. And the person I wanted to do this interview tonight was Susan Glasser, because one of the terrific things she did, which she really got a taste of what the book was going to be about, is she did this fantastic sort of women in foreign policy interview with me, Madeleine Albright, and Michelle Flournoy, where we told some of the stories that ended up in the book. And so when I thought about who was incisive, who understood all of these dynamics, and who was also a brilliant journalist, Susan was at the top of the list, so she was the first choice, and thank you very, very much for coming here tonight. Now I'll get to your question.
See, this is why you ended up in diplomacy in the State Department. When my son does this, I call it silver tonguing.
I also just want to mention, so you can come and ask him later, the ambassador from the European Union, David O'Sullivan, and his great wife are here with us tonight, too, and he can explain why they use these crazy acronyms that are different than what Americans use. But he can explain that, and I'll introduce some other people as we go along. Look, I do think the president, as my business partner and former boss and dear friend Madeleine Albright says, is the most undemocratic president the United States has ever had. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. Is he a true and full autocrat? That takes consciousness. That takes purposefulness and intention. And I think he is, to use a phrase many people have used, so narcissistic. On a day when we are all thinking and praying for people who are facing an 15-foot surge of water to take over their homes, their livelihoods, their future, their foreseeable future, and he's debating whether 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico, I don't even know what that is. I don't know. I don't think that's an autocrat. I don't think it's a president. I don't know what it is. But it's certainly undemocratic. And I think I was saying to Bruce, my husband who's here, Bruce Stokes, who I write about in the book, it's just astonishing where we are. And Joe Kennedy, I think, tweeted the right tweet about today, which is, if you're brown or black, you don't matter. If you're white, you do.
So how does that figure into what you see them doing with the Iran deal?
Well, look, it was no surprise that the president was going to pull out of the Iran deal. When Tillerson at McMaster left, the writing was on the wall, because I think you all had reported, journalists quite well, that they had really held the president's feet to the fire and said, okay, decertify the deal, but don't reimpose the sanctions, sort of hold it together with a little bit of glue. When they left, it was clear there was nobody to restrain the president anymore from what he wanted to do, and certainly John Bolton wasn't going to restrain him from doing that. I've said publicly, Bolton's never seen a war he didn't want to wage. So I think that it was not shocking. I happened to have been in Malta on the day it happened, walking on the cobblestone streets of that city in the evening, and it had happened. I was going out for several drinks. And John Kerry actually called me on the phone. He was somewhere in Europe and wanted to, I think, commiserate and also sort of say, we're going to persist, which the book is a lot about persistence. It's a lot about persistence. And I'm, as many of you in this room are, if I can tell by the color of your hair or lack thereof, I came of political age in the 60s when there was enormous violence in this country, the Vietnam War. People who tried to register folks to vote were killed. We had Kent State. It was really quite awful. Bombs in the townhouses in New York by the weathermen. But we came through that time with great difficulty, and we went on to Reagan and Nixon, so it wasn't all gravy. But it did bring us the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, a resurgent women's movement, and the end of the Vietnam War. So I am an optimist at heart, and it's going to take everybody voting, and so everybody should do everything they can to get people to vote come the 2018 election and then the 2020 election to see our way through this. It's tough.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you use that phrase optimist. You say in the book, and I agree with you, that in some ways diplomats are the eternal optimists of the political system, because in fact diplomacy is about sometimes not about winning or losing, but just keeping time on the clock, or keeping a process going. And in fact, you write in the book about your encounters with the Oslo peace process, which we're marking the anniversary. In fact, today I believe it is of
it is today.
When President Clinton hosted that famous handshake here in Washington, where at a much less optimistic moment, unfortunately, with Israel and the Palestinians. You also write about North Korea, where you and Secretary Albright, were there arguably at the last moment when there was a genuine, prospect for a peace deal. You say that you believe that North Korea was ready for a deal back in 2000, but that the United States wasn't. And now there's the Iran deal, which the United States has pulled out of, but the other parties too have remained in. So I guess my question is, are there realistic grounds for optimism given where we are, with Israel and the death of the Oslo hope, given where we are with Iran?
I think we're at a very, very dangerous and insecure moment. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat that. With Iran, with North Korea, there is no evident plan B. There is no evident strategy. There is no evident set of steps to try to get from here to there. There's a lot of impulse. There's a lot of photo opportunities. I was someone who supported the president meeting with Kim Jong-un. And the reason I supported it is because Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump both believe they are the only ones who matter. Now, in Kim Jong-un's society, that's true. He is the only one who matters. He does have to watch his military, but he pretty much is the only decider. In our country, we actually do ostensibly have checks and balances and a constitution, and the president isn't the only power that matters, but he thinks he is. So I thought, well, maybe they'll find a way to break through the impasse here. But I also said only if there was a detailed plan to go with it, a team ready to go, the discipline to do the hard work, to understand there was going to be no quick fix. This was going to be a very tough slog, much tougher than the Iran deal, which was tough enough. And what happened was there was the meeting, but as soon as the president hugged Kim Jong-un, which he literally did, we saw the Chinese realize they didn't have to enforce the sanctions anymore. The Russians already weren't following any of the sanctions. There wasn't a next step and a next step. The piece of paper that came out of that summit was the thinnest piece of paper out of any encounter between the South Koreans and the North, between us and the North, between anybody in the North. So it is quite concerning that we're about to look at a second summit. And again, I'm glad that Steve Biegun has been appointed by Pompeo to be an envoy. Steve Biegun was with Ford Motor Company for years. He worked in the U.S. government before that at the National Security Council on Capitol Hill. He's a capable professional. He's reaching out to talk to people and get information. But one thing I always knew when I was negotiating the Iran deal is that President Obama was not going to pull the rug out from under me. I knew what he wanted to have happen. He was transparent. We had a decision-making process, sometimes an excruciating decision-making process, lots of meetings in the Situation Room, but I knew I wouldn't have the rug pulled out from under me. Steve Biegun will never be able to count on that. Never.
Well, actually, to your point, I just finished writing my column for tomorrow. The day after Steve Biegun's appointment was announced by Mike Pompeo, Pompeo went to the Oval Office, met with Trump, who said we should cancel the trip that you're about to make to North Korea with Steve Biegun. So that was his first day on the job.
Point taken.
Point taken. Okay, so one of the things that's very interesting to me and was the theme of an excerpt from the book that ran by my former colleagues in Politico magazine, is actually about this element of writing a woman's life into the very male-dominated story of American politics and American diplomacy. And I think that's where you bring real passion in the book, some of it unexpected. You tell the story in the book about how even no less a feminist than Hillary Clinton balked initially when your name was proposed for a very senior and important job at the State Department, one that you ultimately got. What did that episode tell you about what happens to women in these male-dominated professions?
I think we all become warped in our sensibilities about this. I do say in the acknowledgments in the book, this is my recollection of things, and we all recall things differently. So Secretary Clinton may have a different view of that process. But what Susan's talking about is I sort of let it be known that I would be interested in being the undersecretary. Bill Burns was being promoted to deputy secretary. And I didn't hear much. I talked to Cheryl Mills a little bit. She said to me, we'll see. And things went quiet. And when things go quiet in Washington, you should be quiet, because otherwise you just become part of the blood sport of the journalists who like to write about in Politico who's going to be what next. So
sort of seems like a quaint blood sport these days, doesn't it?
Yes, and very, very quaint, actually, relative to today. You're quite right, Susan. So anyway, I got a call from Cheryl, and she said, well, you've come back to us again as someone we should consider, but there are some concerns, so why don't we have brunch? So we met for brunch on a Sunday morning, and it turned out the concerns were that I wasn't a team player. Now, in code in my life, not being a team player means you're too assertive, you're too tough, you're too strong, you're too outspoken, which, quite frankly, for all you wonderful gentlemen in the room, is rarely said about you, but often said about women. And so I told, and Cheryl wouldn't tell me where this was coming from, which I respect, but I said, well, maybe it was when I was Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs under Warren Christopher, and sort of the Hill hated me because I wouldn't let them have access to anybody they wanted in the department. Julia Freifield's here. She knows that job. It's a really tough one. And the people in the State Department don't like you because you won't let them go up to the Hill unless it's a priority of the President and the Secretary of State. So you're sort of hated by everybody. So maybe it came from that. So she said, okay, well, let me talk to Hillary. And I heard a little later, okay, she'll see you at her house one evening. I met with her. She raised the same issues, which I valued that she was direct enough. I told her, where I thought that came from, what I would do, how I was a team player, blah, blah. I think Bill Burns was immensely helpful in reassuring her I would be. We'd worked together back during President Clinton's time. And I became the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. The one part that's not in that Politico that's really important is we all do this. I did this to my own mother. When my mother died, quite suddenly, I went to her funeral, of course, and there were literally hundreds of people at her funeral. Now, I expected that when the day came that my father passed away, because he was a prominent businessman and activist in Baltimore and in the community. And although my mother sold condos, I didn't see her that way. I saw her as my mom. She actually was a mentor to literally hundreds of young real estate agents who saw her as a seasoned professional. And I had to think of my mother in a whole different way. And so the lesson I'm trying to convey in that part of the book is that we have to work hard not to stereotype each other, that we have to see each other as we are in all of our fullness, and not just in perhaps the narrow experience we might have.
Well, this brings up a question we grappled with. It. You mentioned that Alpha Ladies conversation that you and I did with you and Madeleine Albright and Michelle Flournoy. And yet there's often a tension, isn't there, between the idea that just having women present at the table is going to inherently change things. There have been 3 women secretaries of state. There's a sense, okay, well, there's a lot of women running for Congress now. You were, at one point in your career, the executive director of Emily's List, which is dedicated to electing women to the House and Senate. That's a big theme in the 2018 midterm elections. But I have to say, as you reflected back on all these experiences, where do you come down on the question of women's representation as inherently, changing things or addressing the structural inequities that women still face? I mean, I'm really still of 2 minds of it. For example, you often hear in diplomacy, well, if we had more women at the table, there'd be fewer wars. Do you really think it's as simple as that?
No, I don't think anything is that reductionist on most things in life. I do think that we have a different perspective. I think people who come from any different walk of life, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity, bring value to the table. And if you're trying to solve a big problem, it's important to have that diversity at the table. I also do believe in some of the work of Carol Gilligan. I think that, in a different voice, I think that women tend to see things horizontally and in relationship to other people. Women, when they talk about their jobs, generally don't start out by saying, what's your title and how much money are you making? We generally start out saying, how are you managing everything? If you've got kids, how are you juggling these things? How are you dealing with your boss? Are they giving you the space you need? Do they listen to you? We just come to this with different experience and with different approach and with different strengths. And in the Iran negotiation, it was an astonishingly unusual circumstance. Although the entire Iranian delegation was men, though most of the Iranian journalists are women, interestingly, but were men, and most of the other delegations were all men. The negotiation was coordinated by the European Union. And the European Union was represented, first the High Representative was Cathy Ashton, and then the second High Representative during this time was Federica Mogherini. And their deputy is a really unsung hero of this negotiation, Helga Schmidt, who's now a very dear friend of mine. A German diplomat who was detailed to the European Union and works there. And so 3 women at any one time spent more time with the Iranians than anybody else. John Kerry certainly spent a lot of time with the Iranians, but Helga and I decidedly, fundamentally much more. And I think it did matter because we were about getting the work done. And I would say that is the other difference. We women probably need to do more to flack our own books and sing our own songs. But we do worry about doing the work, not just getting the next job.
Let me go back for 1 second. I want to keep on this, but let me go back for 1 second to the substance of the deal itself. President Trump, as you know, over and over again has called this the worst deal ever. The worst.
Do you think
deal
he's
ever.
ever read it?
I doubt he has. That was going to be my. What do you think it is that particularly is the obsession around the terms of this deal, and what for you was the big concern about it when you finished it? Obviously, part of it was a political concern, which is it going to float in the American political system and on Capitol Hill? But substantively, is there anything of merit to this?
So the president is continuing the tradition of the Republican Party at the time of the deal. At the time of the deal, the Republicans voted against it. And the day that we completed the deal, they announced they were against it before they had ever read it. And I'm sure most of them have never read it. Throughout the process, they got staggering numbers of secure room briefings. I give the Congress, both the House and the Senate, credit because they came to those briefings. They asked questions. They did try to learn things. But at the end of the day, it was all about politics, quite frankly. And the president, I think, saw that those politics mattered. Some of those politics, to be perfectly straightforward about it, have to do with the Prime Minister of Israel. And with our own politics and our own campaign finance. Some of it has to do with concerns by our Gulf partners who are very worried, understandably so, as is Israel, understandably so and realistically so, about malign activities by Iran in the region. That's a very, very real concern. But what President Obama understood was that if we didn't ensure that Iran didn't get a nuclear weapon. We had to ensure that Iran would never get a nuclear weapon so that they could not project even more power into the Middle East and deter our and our allies and partners' actions. And he understood that if we tried to do everything in one deal, first of all, I wouldn't be here yet. I'd still be negotiating the deal. Second, if you put everything in one deal, you end up negotiating against yourself. So the Iranians would say, okay, we'll tell Hezbollah to not shoot so many rockets into Israel, but then we want to keep more advanced centrifuges. So you do yourself in. You get neither assurance that they will never get a nuclear weapon, and you don't get what you want on their malign behavior in the Middle East. So the idea was to get the nuclear weapon off the table, keep all the sanctions on their bad behavior, their state sponsorship of terrorism, human rights, their arms and missile production. We have sanctions on all of those things. as do many of our allies and partners, and go at that full bore.
Now, when you say forever, I should footnote or asterisk that there, one of the most controversial provisions of the deal is the so-called sunset provision, the idea that, essentially what you're doing is freezing in place, as opposed to they didn't sign a document saying they would never. Well,
actually, the document does say they will never. So the document says they will never. It is not literally signed because it is a political agreement, not a treaty, though I would point out that people even leave treaties. We have. The Russians have. And may again. So treaties don't give you actually a whole lot more security, maybe more support politically, but nothing more. I do want to point out, since we're talking about Iran, and I just saw him in the back, Jason and Yegi Razayan, who are here. And I'm sorry. Oh. Yeah, Jason and Yegi are back there. There are seats up here if you want them. And for those of you who don't know, Jason Razayan, who is a Washington Post columnist and reporter, spent way too much time in Evin prison in Iran. Oh, you okay? No one got hurt? Okay. And Yegi, his wonderful wife, was in prison briefly herself. And I'm really thrilled that part of what happened as a result of this deal, and a separate track that I don't write a lot about in this book, we'll wait for Jason's book, is about what we did to try to bring them and other Americans home. We weren't able to bring Robert Levinson home, who's been missing for way too long, many years. And there are some other dual American Iranian citizens who are in Evin prison. And there is a Princeton researcher, an American, who should not be in jail and is in jail. So it is an ongoing and very difficult situation, but I'm so glad you're here. Thank you.
So, connecting the dots back between the Iran deal and this thread of what it means to be a woman doing these jobs that have been previously done by men, the book opens with this very dramatic, and I think any woman who's ever had any professional role can empathize with this, really sort of agonizing moment where at a key moment you end up unintentionally, crying, which is basically the nightmare scenario for almost any woman who's ever been in a workplace situation. What did it feel like to be crying in front of people who literally wouldn't shake your hand?
Yeah. I tell that story at the beginning of the book, and I've told it publicly, and it's incredible the controversy that it creates. And the amount of tweets I've gotten about how hideous it is that I did that, which is sort of interesting. Not
hideous that you cried.
Hideous that I cried. Yes.
That you wrote about it.
Both. But most of the tweets against it are, quite frankly, gentlemen from guys who see it as weak. And my point in telling it, and I'll tell it briefly, we were on day 25 of the Iran negotiation. Day 25, in the last round, I spent 27 days in the Palais Coburg in Vienna. I ate one meal outside the hotel during those 27 days. I certainly didn't expect to be there that long. So this was day 25. And one of the last things that had to be negotiated with was the UN resolution, which wasn't literally part of the deal, but had to be redone because of the deal. And because the United States holds the pen at the UN Security Council on Iran negotiations, I was the negotiator for that. And the EU was not present because they aren't on the Security Council. And so it was a bilateral negotiation. Me, Rob Malley, phenomenal guy, who's now head of the International Crisis Group and was my deputy, and Abbas Arachi and Majid Ravanchi, just the four of us in a dining room in the evening. And I had put down on the table a piece of paper with some possibilities that might get us to yes. And they agreed. Abbas said, okay, I can do this. And I said, great. And he said, one more thing, which was a usual Iranian tactic. As soon as you think you're at the end, there's one more thing. And I was already over the time I was supposed to be there. I had said I was going to retire from the State Department, and in September I was going to go to Harvard and be an Institute of Politics fellow and a Belfer fellow and just zone out. And it was clear to me because of the congressional review process, I wasn't going there in September. So I was like, I can't take it, guys. I've had enough. And of course, I'd had no sleep for several days. So I lost it. And somewhere along the line, I learned that I wasn't allowed to be angry, but it was okay to cry. And so when I get angry, I cry. I can do nothing about it. I have tried over the years to dig my fingernails into my hand. You all probably know that trick. To do all kinds of things to hold back the tears, and I cannot hold them back. So here I was yelling at them, which I also don't do very often as a negotiator, yelling at them saying, you know, you've screwed up my life, but more than that, you're gonna lose this deal. You're going to kill this deal, and we have too much at stake. Is that really what you want to do? Tears were coming down Rob had no idea what to do. He's a sweet, wonderful human being, and he just was at a loss. And they were at a loss. They were just stunned. They didn't know what to do with this version of Wendy. So a moment passed, a few moments, and Abbas said, okay, we're done.
Well, it's a great story because it's about the strategic uses of tears in negotiations.
Right. Look, I don't suggest to anyone that they use tears as a tactic or anything they can't control. But what it does say is two things. One, you use everything you can when you have no choice in a negotiation, just like Tom Cotton's letter that he got 47 Republican senators sent to the Iranians directly and said, we're not for this deal. Which was sort of unprecedented to do. I turned around and said to the Iranians, you tell me all the time how you have political problems at home. We have to help you out because you've got a modulus who, you know, isn't going to do what you want them to do. Well, you know, I got political problems too. So, you know, don't make yourself out to be the victim here. So you use whatever you have. But the most important point of that story, and what I try to say throughout the book, is you're most powerful when you are your authentic self. You are most powerful. And I learned that lesson most powerfully from this lady sitting in the front of the room, from Senator Mikulski, who, when she ran for the U.S. Senate, said they probably don't make togas in size 14 petite. And that the Senate, she would be a senator, and this is what a senator would be. Even though she didn't look like the rest of them, act like the rest of them, speak like the rest of them, dress like the rest of them. And that is when we are each our most powerful self.
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of questions probably from the audience. So I think that's a great note to end on. So I want to thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Senator McCall.
Either of these mics, that would be great because we are videotaping and audio taping the event. So make your way up and they'll keep talking until somebody. This can't be a very shy audience.
No, it's not a shy audience. Two things I'll say. One of the other things I say about in the book, and many of the people are scattered here in this room, is nothing happens without an enormous team. That's true for Senator Mikulski's campaign, and a lot of those folks are here. That's true for the Iran deal, and some of those folks are here. It just doesn't happen without a team. And on Iran, people know what President Obama did, and Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz, maybe even me. They don't know what all of our partners did in the P5+1. Sorry, David. They don't know in the European Union. They don't know the 15 people who were on my core team, and they don't know the literally hundreds of people in the U.S. government who worked on this. So I thank all of them and all the teams that are here and make anything possible. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm actually...
I knew the first question was going to be from a guy. If you women don't get up, I'm going to be shamed. Please.
Not just any guy, I'm actually from Iran.
Okay.
So I just wanted to say that with the return of the sanctions, Iranian economy is now in free fall. There are already videos of people fighting over, sanitary pads and, food shortages, medication shortages, and so on. So basically, the people have been taken hostage simultaneously by the Iranian government, which cuts an ear every now and then, and the U.S. government now, which is cutting a finger every now and then. So first of all, what are the people of Iran supposed to do right now? 80 million people have been taken hostage, basically, and this is not what they wanted. And the second question is, why do you think it has become so normal for U.S. government to impose, sanctions, while it knows that, in the case of, North Korea, Cuba, Syria, Iraq, in none of these cases it actually helped the people. It just, actually strengthened the governments.
It's a really, really, really good question. Sanctions don't and didn't stop Iran's nuclear program. When the Europeans began in the early 2000s to negotiate with Iran before we got involved, Iran had 164 centrifuges. By the time we got into serious negotiations in 2013, even though we had the most extensive sanctions, extraordinary sanctions on Iran, Iran had 19,000 centrifuges. So sanctions don't stop bad things. What sanctions do is motivate someone to come to the negotiating table. And in that sense, they did work. I believe the way that President Trump and his administration are using the sanctions aren't about coming to the negotiating table, in spite of the president saying, I'll meet with President Rouhani anytime, anyplace, anywhere. They are about what I would call a soft regime change effort. To get the Iranian people to rise up and do in the Iranian government. Now, Jason and Yevgeny and you probably know better than I what a dicey deal that is. The Iranian government is excellent at oppression and excellent at holding back revolution. They got created in a revolution. They understand revolution. And it is a culture of resistance. And the one thing that Trump is doing probably among some of the Iranian people is making the United States the bad guy. It's great for nationalism to have an outside enemy. So, I don't think this is what we should be doing now. There is no question that sanctions hurt people. When Obama did it, we did have a humanitarian channel. Food and medicine was outside of the embargo. We tried to make sure that people had energy needs they needed for daily life. But there's no question sanctions are not nice. They hurt people. That is true.
Well, thanks, but it is really hurting people there.
I know. I'm not for what the president's doing.
Yeah.
I think he's not going to get what he wants. It's hurting people badly. And at some point, Europe is doing whatever they can to try to hold this deal together. And hold it together with the Russians and the Chinese, which is sort of curious. Europeans working with the Russians and Chinese and not the United States. What's wrong with that picture? So, but Europe's going to have a really nearly impossible time doing that once the November sanctions go into place, which is an oil embargo from the United States and secondary economic sanctions, which means if a business is doing business with the Central Bank of Iran, they can't do any business with a U.S. bank. The Europeans are trying to figure out a way to help small and medium enterprises stay in Iran anyway, but I think it's going to be virtually impossible. And the Iranians, I think, understand quite well that if they pull out right now, Trump wins. But at some point, they're not going to have a choice. It's going to fall apart, I believe. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it holds together, but I think it's very, very tough.
Hi.
Hi, thank you.
Yes, I felt challenged to come and ask you a question.
Excellent.
I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I know you spoke of the team you worked with. I wondered if you had any advice for the people who are still working in the government, particularly the State Department, about how to deal with this very difficult situation we're all facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for your service very much. and gives me an opportunity to introduce Margot Morris, who's sitting up here, who's in the book. You can wave. Anyway, she went in the back. Margot and I first met when she was in the Foreign Service, and I came to the State Department. I wanted someone who understood the building, as we call it. And we've been each other's work spouses ever since, for now almost 25 years. So what we both tell people who call us all of the time, who are still inside, as it were, is to try to stay as long as you can, because we need your institutional knowledge, we need your expertise, we need you to be there when we get to a better place, in my view. But for every person, there is a point at which they reach a threshold where their moral conscience does not allow them to do that. Our DCM in China left and resigned because he thought climate, and if you live in Beijing, you know this to be true, climate was a premier issue for him. And when Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord, which technically you can't do, but he did it anyway, he could not stand that. Our ambassador in Mexico, who is a dear friend, Roberta Jacobson, finally decided she could not stay because of the approach to Mexico that was being taken. So it's a very tough question, but I urge people to stay as long as they can, and particularly junior folks and mid-level folks. Please, please, please stay, because a lot of the senior folks were either driven out or left, and there will be a turn of the wheel. We will get to a better time. We will get to a leader of the State Department who believes there actually should be vacancies filled at the State Department, of which there are a gazillion vacancies at very senior levels, and we'll need those mid-level people to rise up and fill those spots.
Can I just interject a question that is probably naturally popping to mind to follow up to that? Are you, to be clear, are you advocating that people should stay inside and resist President Trump from within? And, do you think, what was your view of the anonymous op-ed, and whether that, a lot of people have said that they actually disagree and think that the principled thing would be for that person to quit rather than to stay inside the administration and resist internally?
I think that a lot of people, the good news about there not being a lot of senior people is, particularly if you're out in the field as a diplomat, you just do what you think you need to do. So most ambassadors and DCMs don't ask for instructions. A, they probably won't get them. B, they won't understand them. C, the president may disagree with them. So they focus on helping American business that wants to invest in that country. They focus on, democracy building. They focus on what AID can do. They focus on helping American citizens and who are visiting or working in that country. So they do the daily bread and butter of what is our job as diplomats. I think it's much harder for those who are here in Washington, much harder. So again, it's really about what your job is, how high you are up. The lower you are, the better off you are. The higher you are, it's hard to keep your head down. David Hale, who's just replaced the position I held as undersecretary, is a career Foreign Service officer, very capable, very terrific. I give him a lot of credit for trying, and we'll see. If David feels like he gets to a place where he can't get anything done, he'll probably speak up. As to Anonymous, I wish Anonymous had spoken out and said who he or she was. I suspect it's a he, but I wish they had. But these are very hard decisions. And what I said at the time, because I do some MSNBC TV from time to time, what I said at the time was, I wish people would focus less on who the hell it is and more on the substance of what was said, which we've now heard, first in Fire and Fury, which we all thought was just, good gossip. Omarosa, which we just thought was crazy.
She's got tapes.
Right, she's got tapes. And now with Bob Woodward's book, we know it all to be true. So let's talk about the substance and not focus so much on the fun guessing game of who it was.
So I guess that means you're not going to tell us who you think it was.
No.
I'm sorry my gender disappoints you, but
It doesn't. I've been married to one of you for 38 years.
oh, you know the tribulations well. Then, I'm curious to know that in the Iranian agreement negotiations, to what extent was U.S. diplomacy complicated by your partnership with the European countries and the EU?
Well, I wouldn't say it's complicated. By one of the things I write about in the book is that if you negotiate, you have to leave everybody with enough power to deal with their politics and to deal with their interests. Otherwise, you won't have a durable agreement and you won't get to one. There was no question that the United States was the big foot in the room. I think even the ambassador might agree with that. Big foot in the sense that if it didn't work and military action had to be taken, it was going to be our military who took the action, or at least led the action. Our economic sanctions, though, the European Union putting a full oil embargo on was quite important in the process, made a huge difference. And Europe certainly does a fine job, as the French often do in their Gallic independence, of exercising veto rights. They're quite good at it. But we worked really pretty well as a team, and I give a lot of credit to first Kathy and then Federica and to Helga. There was tons of process, staggering amounts of process. I joke all of the time and say so in the book. I would negotiate inside the administration. I would negotiate with the Hill. I would negotiate with interest groups here in the United States. I would negotiate with Israel. I would negotiate with the Gulf states. I would negotiate bilaterally with every partner in the P5+1 and then negotiate with them as a group. And occasionally I'd negotiate with Iran. It's a very, very laborious process, but effective.
Ambassador, very good to see you.
Good
Thank
to see you too.
for all of your effort. Jason and I will always be thankful to everything you have done for us and the entire staff at the Obama's administration. You're a great role model for many, many women around the world, especially in my country. I know it's hard to believe, but I remember talking to many young Iranian girls, and they all dream about being the next Wendy Sherman.
That beats the time, Yegi, when people were on the street saying death to Wendy Sherman. So I appreciate that.
I also hope, I don't think they say so, but I also hope that there's a day that the regime in my country stop taking Americans as hostages. If there's one advice you can give to younger women who want to follow your path or Secretary Albright's path and be as successful as you two are, what would that advice be? And not just in this city, not just in America, everywhere, globally. Thank you.
Thank you. Besides getting to know you, Yegi, who you've found great courage. I wish everybody an unexpected life. It has been the greatest gift I have gotten, and I think women in particularly lead unexpected lives by necessity, particularly if you want to be in a relationship, particularly if you want to have children. You never know what's going to come or what you're going to have to juggle, and that's become more and more true for men as well. But certainly in my generation, that was true. And it means then that you should make an asset out of that unexpected life. And when opportunities come along, take them. Risk taking them. There's a Hewlett-Packard study. I don't mention many studies in the book, but I do mention this one that says when men apply for a job, they believe if they have 60% of the qualifications, they're fine. When we apply for a job, we look at everything and we say we have to have them all. We have to meet every qualification. It's ridiculous. There are women here who were my partners when I first went to work for Congresswoman Mikulski, then Congresswoman Mikulski. I'd never worked on the Hill. I had no clue what I was doing. And they sustained me and they helped me. And I would put my faith in any woman to get a job done that needed to be done. So it's about having confidence and belief in yourself, but also being willing to take the risk, even if you think you're only 60% of the way there.
I think we have time for Susan to close us out with a final thought and question. And I just want to mention that if you don't have a copy of the book yet, we have plenty up front. And if you would be kind enough at the end of all this to hold up your chairs and move to the side, Wendy will be signing books up here, but Susan, you've got the last word.
Well, I'm glad to end on that note. I mean, one of the things I learned about you in the book that I didn't know was that you had actually gone back to school and your education was as a social worker. Both of my grandparents were social workers who found a way to politics. And you quote Senator Mikulski in the book as saying that politics is social work by a different form, right?
Social work with power.
Social work with power. With power. It's that P word, I guess, that women are still reluctant to use.
Right. And it's one of the other things I talk about. Women have to get, and all of us, more comfortable with power. Power is not, in and of itself, a terrible thing. It's actually quite nice. It's how you use it and what you use it for that matters. And I hope that throughout my life, for the most part, I've used it in positive and powerful ways. And I thank you all very much for being here this evening.